Right, folks, welcome back. Another episode, another week, all that bollocks. Hang on a minute, can you hear this? That's my dog snoring. Don't worry, I've not been influenced by last week's episode. He's not having a post-coital snooze or anything like that. Right, title of today's episode is Shibboleths and Cuntwaffles. So if you're wondering what the hell that's referring to, basically today we're talking about swearing, profanity, cussing, blaspheming, effing and jeffing, or just being a potty-mouthed twat. My guest today is Professor Benjamin Bergen. Ben is a professor at the UC San Diego Department of Cognitive Science and director of the Language and Cognition Lab, whose research interests include language, cognition, computation, and the brain. He's the author of Louder Than Words, The New Science of How the Mind Makes Meaning, and the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, which is What the F, What Swearing Reveals About Our Language, Our Brains, and Ourselves. So, as well as being a sort of interesting discussion in and of itself, turned out to be a bit of a revelatory conversation or episode for me personally, this one as well. So, basically, quite early on in the discussion, me and Ben talk about, we talk about something that Ben has coined the holy fucking shit nigger principle. And that's basically the observation that the vast majority of profanity is derived from either blasphemy, that's the holy, sex, that's the fucking, bodily functions, that's the shit, and slurs, that's the M-word. And it sort of made me realise that a lot of subjects on like the fringes of the Overton window and beyond, what we call the Overton wasteland, a lot of the stuff that we talk about on this podcast and that I plan on talking about on this podcast, sort of, who's this texting me now while I'm trying to work? Oh, it's the missus. So, I don't know how much I can tell you with this. She thought she'd made like a major mistake at work. Yeah, I can't really tell you much. The other night, she's working from home and she made a major balls up or something, which she thought was going to cost her a job. So we've been sat here the past couple of nights sort of stressing about what's going to happen. Is she going to get fired? And what we're going to do about it? How we're going to deal with losing her income and all that nonsense. And I couldn't give a shit, to be honest, because I'm figure these things out, but no problem. Got to do what you got to do and all that. She'd been having like panic attacks and all tearful and stressed out and stuff like that. Anyway, so she's messaged the boss and told him what happened. But she messaged him 2 days ago when it happened, just sort of fessed up straight away. And he hasn't got back to her. So she's been thinking, oh my God, like maybe he's planning like a severance package or just going to fire her or whatever. And yeah, he's just messaged her back then and just the email just says, no problem. So all that stress for nothing. Anyway, what was he talking about? This is very unprofessional. So, oh yeah, that was it. So yeah, I was thinking that this podcast, the remit of this podcast seems to fall within those same four principles. So, you know, for instance, we talked about bestiality, and we did the episode with my friend Elise on prostitution. So, you know, that's sort of sex and bodily functions to an extent. We talked about the Holocaust and we've done hate speech and sort of racism came up on both those occasions. You know, I've got plans to discuss Islam and Scientology, trying to negotiate a conversation with someone who was in a Christian cult, that's religion. And then, you know, no doubt we're going to end up talking about like death and disease and, you know, weird sex fetishes, which inevitably will cover bodily functions again. So I just thought there was a sort of interesting little parallel going on there. And it got me thinking, like, do I just want this podcast to be about that, to exist within that sort of narrow remit? I mean, it's not that narrow. I mean, we did mental health and got, what was it, like 96 episodes out of that. But then, you know, the other day I was listening to a podcast by a guy who just talks about keyboards. And he's done hundreds of episodes. And thingy, these sorts of keyboards, computer keyboards. It was actually really interesting, the one I listened to anyway. So, I mean, there's still plenty to be discussed, even if we did stick within that particular remit. But I don't know, when I made that connection, I just thought like it feels too narrow for some reason. But luckily, one of the other things that I got from this podcast with Ben was it was fun. So I enjoyed this episode. I mean, I enjoy them all to an extent, but this was just, it was relaxed. We're just playing around with ideas, and there was nothing at stake in the same way as, say, with like the Holocaust episode, or like the episode I did with Tom O'Carroll on paedophilia, who, by the way, sneak peek, I tried to interview again last week and it was a disaster. And he had a paddy and saw his ass and stormed off and quit the interview and what have you, because I came prepared this time. So that episode will still be coming out, and it's going to be a rebuttal of the last episode we did with him, because basically pretty much everything he told us last time regarding the evidence in favour of paedophilia was lies, basically. And I'm going to do a comprehensive rebuttal of all the evidence that he presented, because he had my eyes out, basically. But anyway, so yeah, those types of episodes are sort of, they're stressful to do. And I only used to do them occasionally, but with the new remit, it's all the time. But this one wasn't. This one was fun. And it was fun for a couple of reasons, because I suppose one is that Ben's just a great teacher. He's one of those teachers who should teach teachers how to teach. But also, like I say, there's nothing at stake. And I mean, you know, there are people who are going to get angry that you've got two white guys on this episode using the N-word and what have you. And we cover that very topic in the conversation as well. But it's not the same as, say, the Holocaust denial episode, where I'm not just playing devil's advocate. I feel like I'm representing a group of people to an extent. And because it's such a sensitive topic, people scrutinise those episodes to a higher degree. You know, I had someone on Twitter the other week saying I didn't push back enough against Carolyn Yeager with her Holocaust denial. And that's, despite, you go and listen to that episode, we agree on practically nothing. Like, every point she brings up, I disagree with her, argue against it, present some evidence, and at the end of the conversation, we shared no common ground whatsoever. But it's just with certain groups of people or certain ideas, I think the audience aren't happy unless you sort of resort to berating them and name-calling and getting aggressive and what have you, which I just refuse to do. But with topics like this, when you're not sort of repping a side, it's just way less stressful, way more fun. And it's just sort of been a little reminder to me to make sure that I include that aspect in the podcast as well, and plenty of it, to sort of water down the heavy stuff a little bit. So plenty more fun stuff, weird stuff, bizarre stuff, just, I don't know, downright ridiculous as well. So, you know, in amongst the politics and the racism and the sex and the violence, we want to pepper a little bit of like flat earth and Illuminati lizard people and Bigfoot and alien abductions and ghosts and near-death experiences and all that bollocks as well, basically. So just more to look forward to, I guess. And just, yeah, thank you to Ben for being a little reminder that it doesn't have to be heavy to be interesting. We can keep it light and keep it fun and still keep it interesting. So anyway, enough of me talking shite. There's going to be plenty more of that for you in this episode. And a quick warning as well, there is a lot of swearing in this one. Got the C word, the N word, the F word, the other F word, all for educational purposes, of course, but just in case any of you are sensitive Sallys out there, just a little pre-warning. Anyway, talking about throwing money at me, we weren't, but we're going to now. If you'd like to support the podcast, a couple of ways you can do so. If you fancy some little rewards in return for your generosity, things like a shout out on the podcast, a personalised thank you video, or a producer credit, just head on over to Subscribestar at subscribestar.com/Renegade Ape, where you can subscribe for as little as £2 a month. Or if you want to just chuck us a few quid without being mithered, just head to renegadeape.com/support, where you can make a one-time or recurring donation. Anyway, that's enough of Oliver Twisting It. Please enjoy my conversation with Professor Benjamin Bergen. Right, okay, boys and girls, welcome back. Another episode. This week we're discussing profanity, which is it's something I'm consider myself a bit of a specialist in, but only from a lay perspective. But today we're going to go pretty deep into it. So yeah, as mentioned in the intro, my guest today is Professor Ben Bergen. So Ben, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks. Yeah, my pleasure.
Right. So let's get ourselves into trouble straight away. Okay. So I'm going to quote a paragraph from your book, which is What the F? What Swearing Reveals About Our Language, Our Brains and Ourselves. And so this particular paragraph is referring to the differences between surveys taken in different countries where participants rank words based on how offensive they consider them to be. So, some words behave similarly across surveys. For instance, cunt, motherfucker and nigger show up in the top 5 in each list, while in both lists, bloody and crap appear not to widely offend. But at the same time, there appear to be substantial regional differences. Wanker shows up at a prominent number 4 in the Great Britain list, just ahead of nigger. But on the New Zealand list, it falls in the middle of the pack at number 14, right before whore. Similarly, bollocks finds itself on the more severe side of the Great Britain study, wedged between packy and arsehole. But on the New Zealand list, it falls nearly to the bottom, coming right after crap. So, that one paragraph provides us with about 90% of the material required for this interview. And the first thing about it is, on the face of it, Ben, there's something sort of, besides potentially being offensive, there's something sort of silly and immature and ridiculous about that paragraph. It sounds silly and ridiculous. And so the first thing is, how did you come to study this particular topic?
Well, I aim for ridiculous. That's where we're. That's the guiding star, right? No, I study language, and if you're really passionate about something, you want to know everything about it, and that includes not just the sort of clean and suitable for morning television kind of content, but also the more evocative, the more emotional, the more taboo sides of it. And so I've always had an interest in taboo language alongside the studies of grammar and meaning and sound structures that I've pursued over my career. And at one point, I actually started this project as a way to engage people who didn't have the same passion for language that I have. I was teaching an introductory linguistics class, and 18 to 22-year-olds are interested in lots of things, but ditransitive clauses is not one of them. And it occurred to me, I was teaching this class normally, that there was one point in the class where they found themselves really engaged, and that's where we talked about this effect called temesis, or infixation. And it just so happens that infixation is kind of like prefixation or suffixation. It's where you add a little bit to a word, but with infixation you stick it into the middle of the word, and it just so happens that in English the only things that you can infix in other words are profanity. So halla-fucking-lulia, or chatta goddamn nougat. And so...
Is that true? Does that hold?
Right.
Totally? There's no other... I mean, you could do something that's sort of less offensive, like halla-flipping-lulia, but...
That's right.
Yeah, it's really only that sort of language that you can do that with?
Yeah, it's either profanity or what are called minced oaths. So like darn or friggin', or, as you said.
Right, okay.
But yeah, so at this point we're studying the structure of words, and all of a sudden I've got a classroom full of undergraduates who actually care about what are the rules. Well, why is it chat a goddamn nougat and not chat goddamn a nougat? Why is it not chat a new goddamn
right?
What is it about what's special about the way that we configure it? And it occurred to me that all of language is like this. It's not just how words are structured. Grammar is like this. There's special grammar for profanity. There's special ways that language changes over time historically when it's profane compared to the way that mundane language changes. And it occurred to me that, wow, you could teach a whole class about language that was far more engaging than the typical way you could you could teach all the same stuff. You could inflame passions even better if you did it this way. And that class turned into the idea for a book to go even deeper and really focus on the profanity itself and ask not just what is profanity as an overture to language in general, but what's special about profanity that it tells us that's different from what you learn from the rest of language. What does it tell us that's different about the brain or about social interactions or whatever it is? And yeah, so that's where the idea for the project came from.
Yeah, and when I was saying as well, Ben, that it sounds ridiculous, of course I wasn't referring to the work. I mean, it's that juxtaposition which makes it humorous, because your book, that I've not read cover to cover, I've had a scan through it, but it's very well sourced, and it's a popular book. It's for the layperson, but it's very well researched. It's an academic work as well at the same time. But it's just that juxtaposition of academic concepts mixed in with words like bollocks and arseholes that adds that humour to it. And I'm wondering just whether, just at a professional level, well, a couple of things actually, one more serious in a minute, but firstly, do you struggle for this to be sort of taken seriously amongst, say, other academics? Is there a sort of snobbery around this topic at all?
Oh, I don't think there's snobbery. I think that there are taboos. So the
Right.
reason that you don't get so much study of this language is that the content itself is taboo, and it's hard to make it seem serious. I think you're exactly right. People's first impression is, well, you're just doing that because it's fun, or because it's provocative. It doesn't actually have any value itself. I think part of what the book tries to do is articulate exactly what the value is. You know, what we can learn about aphasia and consequences of traumatic brain injury and so on by looking at, you know, when people preserve the ability to swear and whatnot. But yeah, no, I think there's a general concern that it might not be serious. But no, I don't think I haven't had any sort of negative repercussions. No one's come back to me and said no tenure review committee or anything has come back and said, oh well, no, you need to do something legitimate. You need to do legitimate science, and that's in part because exactly what you describe. You know, I think that if you want to do science, you should be doing science, and you go through rigorously, and you ask the questions, and you use all of the principles of logic and empirical inquiry, and you do it right, and you apply it to whatever your object of study is, and you can do that for profanity. And yes, yeah, I totally get it. It seems funny in the same way. I think that works for a lot of good comedy. It has this juxtaposition between the form and the content, right? And so that's partly intended.
It's interesting you sort of segued perfectly for us there into sort of more serious question, I guess. So it's good, I would say it's great that you've not had any sort of career consequences as a result of this work. However, sort of tied to that, I wonder if you worry about that. So the book came out I've got it down as September 2016. So this is just before Trump was elected. This is before sort of cancel culture went crazy. And there have been, I've been looking at this, there's been some professors that have been either suspended or fired, put on indefinite leave due to using the M-word in an academic context. So Laurie Scheck, Pulitzer-nominated poet, professor at New School in New York City, she was investigated for using the N-word during a discussion about James Baldwin. And then just last week, Professor Greg Patton, the University of Southern California, he was teaching students about communications in the Chinese language. And it just so happened that it says in China that common pause word is that, which in China is pronounced nega. Now he's been put on leave for that. So not even using the word itself, just something that sounds like it. But bringing this back to you, so I mean, you've actually named... And this is what we'll get to in a minute. So chapter 1 in your book is titled Holy Fucking Shit Nigger. And this is based on what you've coined the holy fucking shit nigger principle. So you've been daring enough to name a principle with that most taboo of words within it. And I'm just wondering if in the 4 years since the book came out, has that become a concern for you? Are you worried that's something that might come back to haunt you?
Well, it's definitely true that sensitivities to language have become very prominent in the last well, really the last decade. And there's this fascinating change in power structure that's happened. When we were, when I was in college, for example, in the 90s, and I think for decades before that, there was this feeling that there were authority structures, the old people, who were telling us what to do, and we were fighting out against it. We were rebelling against it. And we had very little power. And now everything is totally flipped, where corporations, politicians, people who you would normally think are loci of power are very nervous because they can be canceled by a campaign where 18-year-olds, 15-year-olds can decide that they don't like the language that they're using, and that can have all kinds of consequences for them. So I think that's a fascinating change that's happened. I am not personally concerned, I think, for a couple of reasons. The first is that I work for a public university that, unlike the other universities that you mentioned, has a transparent and equitable structure and set of systems and processes for evaluating and maintaining intellectual freedom. There's no dean who is going to come through and say, no, you can't use that word. It would have to be a jury of my peers. So I'm not worried for career purpose, for my own, employment purposes. I'm also not that concerned because I think that the book and my discussions of the book have been very sensitive to the concerns. I've got 2 chapters in there about the debate around whether slurs in particular should be co-opted by groups who are offended by them, and what the effects are, and what the sort of empirical evidence is on what happens when you do that. I've got a chapter in there on slurs and what the negative consequences are especially for kids. We have some evidence on how being called by slurs can affect the well-being of particularly middle school children over time. That I think that the content stands the test of scrutiny. So yeah, I'm not too concerned. The name for that principle is based on the fact that those 4 categories of experience: religion, sex, bodily functions, and groups of other people who have less power, are the sources for most of the profanity that exists around the world. It's I agree, it's a cheeky title because it uses provocative words, but the use for it is exactly to evoke that response, to say, oh wow, that is a strong word. Why is that a strong word? Who decides that that's a strong word? What does it mean for it to be strong? Who has the power to change it? What would it take to change it? What are the consequences of using it, and so on? Maybe I'm just blithe to dangers out there, but I haven't encountered any yet.
I guess the one accusation might be, and it'd be the same for me, with the N-word in particular. You're a white guy, I'm a white guy. We've got no right to say that word under any circumstances whatsoever. Now, I would take the opinion of, so this is another professor of history and medieval studies from Augsburg University in Minnesota, Philip Adamo. He was suspended again for discussing James Baldwin. He said, I see a distinction between use and mention. To use the word to inflict pain or harm is unacceptable. To mention the word in a discussion of how the word is used is necessary for honest discourse. Now, I think that's a good distinction to make. But what about you for that accusation in particular? Like, you're a white guy, you've got no place saying that under any circumstances whatsoever.
Yeah. So I'm sensitive to the many positions that exist for not just that word, but any slur. And I realize that is a position that some people would take. It's not the position that everyone takes, and that includes scholars of African American history and of African American language, and so I respect people's right to believe that they can dictate the use of a particular term, but I disagree. And we're fine to. I agree. There's this long history in linguistics of distinguishing between the use of the word and the characterization of the word. I mean, in a way, it's kind of like, what happened before people started studying human sexuality seriously in the 1950s and 60s. They didn't address the content of one of the most important things that we could possibly try to understand, right? The reason for the continued existence of our species. And if you have a ban on scientific scrutiny of something, that just inflames the taboos surrounding it, right? If it's the reason words are considered to be so powerful is exactly because of the strictures that we put in place as individuals and as societies, saying that those words are so bad that they can't be used in certain circumstances. It's that suppression, that creation of a taboo, that gives the word its power. And so I guess, 10 minutes down the conversation, I guess what I would say is, well, if you believe that ordering me not to say the word is going to make a safer world for you, then you're mistaken. Because the imposing of a ban on the use of a particular word, not on using it in a particular way. So not as for example as hate speech or as directed towards someone, but just mentioning, just articulating the word. If you believe that ban is going to make you safer, what it's actually going to do is going to increase the power of that word, so that when people do use it, it will have all the more ability to defame, insult, anger, and so on.
Yeah, I think this is a good little intro because at some point I'm going to do an episode on the M word in particular, and I've got my own views on it. I think you mentioned something on it in the book about this idea of reappropriating the word. I'm not a fan of that. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's a ridiculous idea, reappropriation, and I don't think anybody should use it apart from the way we've just mentioned them between use and mention. Mention it, fine. Using it, I'm not a fan of. It's the one thing I've said to my little boys just turned 10, and they're going to start swearing. I remember we started swearing round about that age, and I said there's certain things that I'm going to let you get away with. The occasional bloody, if that might be okay, but that won't get you bollocked. But no F word or anything like that, except I'm okay with the F word. If he was being bullied by someone, I said anything goes, whatever you've got to do to defend yourself. If you really injure yourself and you said, like, shit or fuck, I'd be okay with that. I'd let you get off with that. But racial slurs, faggot, packy, anything like that, your world will come tumbling down around you. Don't ever let me hear you saying that stuff. So that's my take on it. Just a little teaser there, people. We're gonna get to all this. So let's jump into this principle of yours now, because it is a curiosity that all these words are about bodily functions and sex and God and race. So why is that?
Well, first of all, to establish, it's not just true in English or in the Englishes around the world. It's true in general across the world's languages. So when you look at Chinese, it's the same. When you look at Russian, it's the same. When you look at Hebrew, it's the same. There are a couple of exceptions. So in some languages, you'll get language about animals, for example, and we have that a little bit in English. Ass, kind of, bitch.
Yeah.
In some languages, you have language about death and disease becoming taboo. So in Dutch, for example, tuberculosis, cancer are swear words.
Wow. Okay.
But generally it's the big four, and the generalization is that the things that we find taboo in our lives, in our world experiences, are the things that we don't want to talk about, and those taboos transfer in this sort of, like, we have this weird metaphysical idea that if the thing is bad, then the word for it is also bad. And it doesn't apply to all words for those things necessarily. There are different contexts where you might want to talk about bodily functions to your doctor or your priest or your kindergartner or whatever. So it doesn't transfer to all words, but it does tend to transfer to some words. And And so you see historically taboos for religious concepts, at least in sort of Western history, lending the first taboo language to each of the languages that they're used in. So in the history of sort of Judeo-Christian practice, there's been lots of profane language. In fact, profane actually means outside of the temple, right? There's been lots of profane language that's just drawn from religious terminology. And over the course of centuries, in Western tradition, that's changed so that there are some other taboos that have lent their vocabulary to profanity. So as you get, indoor plumbing and people stop sharing their toileting in public, then all of a sudden those bodily functions become taboo. They're things that you wall off inside of a room, and you not only don't show other people, but you don't talk about so much with other people, and those words then become profane too. In the way that shit becomes profane in maybe the 19th century, but wasn't really previously, largely because of indoor plumbing. And the same with sexuality.
Yeah, but poo, that's not wrong with that. So shit's offensive, poo isn't. Sex isn't offensive, fucking is offensive. So what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I kind of described it as a metaphysical transfer of taboo, right? It's a special thing that happens where some words get this taint, this varnish of negativity associated with the concept. It's a social move, though, right? It's not something that happens on an individual level where an individual just decides, okay, well, these are about this topic, so they're taboo. There's a historical change that happens within a cultural group where they decide, I'm uncomfortable with this word, we're uncomfortable with this word, and so we're going to create norms around it. We're going to say, well, we don't say that word in this circumstance. We don't take the Lord's name in vain, right? You can say Jesus Christ when you mean it this way, but not this other way. You can use this word to describe defecation, but not this other word. It's that social move that's probabilistic. It doesn't happen for all words that have these meanings, but the words that it does happen for mostly have these meanings. And there are lots of other factors. So one factor is what they sound like.
Right.
At least in American English, and I believe this is true of the world's Englishes, although I haven't done the statistics, based on sort of the different rankings of how offensive people in different places around the world find their own English words. At least in American English, there's this really strong tendency for profanity to sound a particular way. It tends to have or be based around these one-syllable words that have lots of consonants, and particularly consonants at the end. And the more consonants, the better. And so, it's one difference between poo and shit is that, shit has both more consonants, and it also has, the right kinds of consonants. These sort of it's got this punchy t at the end.
It has. It's sort of it's choppy, isn't it? It's sort of there's a bang to it, shit and fuck, whereas poo is there's a softness to it, and sex and vagina and cunt. Cunt's got, I mean, that's the ultimate one. What's the word I'm thinking? Is it onomatopoeia?
Well, yes. That would mean that the word sounds like what it means, and I don't think
that's not quite
necessarily can make the case for it.
No.
Yeah, but no, it's kind of like there's a cluster of words that sort of sound similar and have similar meanings. The technical name for that would be phonesthemes or phonesthesia, where the sound and the meaning are patterning together. And you see that in other places. So like lots of our words for, just so happens in English, for light and vision have gl sounds at the beginning. So glitter, gleam, glisten, glow, and so on. It's just these sort of patterns of words that sound similar and also have similar meanings. So that seems to be what's happening in English. And there are different patterns in other languages.
Yeah, I wonder if it's something to do with maybe as well the language doing something different symbolically. I mean, you've got to be careful with symbolism and Freud and all that nonsense. We've done this on the podcast about how much bollocks he used to talk. But again, let's take poo and shit. So when you say that word, and I don't know which way around this is happening as well, I'm thinking you say that word and it doesn't conjure up a sort of a disgusting image of poo so much. Poo, it's childish. It's almost like the emoji picture. It's cartoonish. But then when you say shit, I'm wondering whether, again, symbolic, it just brings up something else. And I'm wondering, is it the word shit came about because it was representing defecation in a more disgusting way? Or has it happened the other way around? Am I making sense there?
Well, I think so. So we definitely create new words or select words to be profane that follow the patterns that precede them. So when you make up a new profanity or a new slur or a new whatever it is, you're affected by what you know about your language already. So there's this new word, but not now not so new, maybe 10 years old, cuck.
Yeah.
Right? That's meant to, I mean, it comes from cuckold, but it's, sort of applied on the internet to mostly liberals as far as I can tell. But it sounds exactly right? So it has consonants at the end, consonant at the beginning. It's got those punchy, what we would call stop consonants or plosives. So a large part of it is probably just a snowballing effect where once you have enough words that sound a particular way and have a particular function, you want the new ones to be like that too.
Right, yeah. Oh, I'm getting into this now. This is fun. Okay, so I tell you what, Ben, this is something that I want to sort of tackle now. It's sort of a dynamic that's going on between the two of us. I don't know if you're feeling it, I'm feeling it. And that is whether there's something going on to do with sort of profanity and how it relates to class status. So let's be honest, you're higher status than me. So you're a university professor. I'm some twat on the internet who puts podcasts out, okay? So profession-wise, you've got higher standing in society than me, more intelligent than me, and so those two things that we can take for granted put you as higher status than me. And even though you've studied this, I've already read an example of that paragraph from your book, that you're clearly not afraid of using this language. Still in this conversation with you, I'm very conscious of offending you. Because...
Oh, well, really? No.
Yeah, because not necessarily offending you, but as maybe coming across as a bit brash and impolite. You know, I invite these people onto the podcast, the professors, academics, researchers, professional people, and you want to come across a certain way. You don't want the person to have a bad experience. And one of the ways I do this is I have to temper my language because I'm working class guy from South Manchester. We call each other a cunt as a term of endearment round here. We were all using that word as teenagers around our mums, and it wasn't a big deal. But like I say, you speak to researchers and academics, and it's almost like when you go around to meet someone's grandma and all, you automatically know to stop swearing. And I'm very conscious of that dynamic between you and I. And I'm just wondering if you know anything about that, whether there are any links between maybe the usage and the levels of offensiveness of profanity and people's socioeconomic status.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I don't know. I don't actually feel a difference in status myself, but in this particular context. But in general, yes, it's absolutely true that use of profanity tracks with informality, with familiarity, and so there are lots of situations where, regardless of sort of socioeconomic status or power status or whatever it is, people will be navigating. So this is my close friend or my group of close friends that I've known since childhood. Regardless of our status, we feel comfortable with one another. We feel that sort of familiarity, closeness. And those are the contexts where you see the most profanity. Obviously, as you move towards more formal contexts, an interview is a more formal context, whether it's a job interview, podcast interview. I think a class, when I'm teaching a class, those are places where, you feel like, okay, so there are some rules here and they don't know me. We in this case, we haven't met before. you don't know what my judgments are going to be if you swear. I don't know what your judgments are going to be if I swear. I don't know what your listeners' judgments are going to be if either of us swear. I don't know them. And so, yeah, you're constantly performing this calculus because, of course, the use of profanity has demonstrable effects, some positive, some negative, in terms of how people judge you. So when people swear, listeners tend to think on the positive side that person is more honest, that they are more likely to actually be telling the truth when they are swearing, that they're more relatable, accessible, that they're funnier. On the other hand, on the negative side, the judgments that we see in experimental work include that the person might be less well-educated, that they might be less intelligent, that they might be more out of control, that they might not know of or comply with social norms. And that last one can be positive or negative depending on what your judgment is about social norms and the particular ones that are being flouted now. So, when you're with people you know really well, you tend to bring the positive judgments to bear.
Yeah.
When you don't know people at all, and when you think it's a really formal situation, where you think it's a situation where the rules should apply, then you tend to bring the more negative judgments to bear. So someone comes to a job interview, you know that they should know that this is a formal situation. They swear, you think they don't know the rules, they're not educated, whatever. But if it were someone who came to that same situation, you've known them forever, you know that or maybe it's a job, it's an interview to go on stage as a comedian, right? It's a stand-up interview. They'd better swear a lot because you want them to seem, because you want them to want to feel to be funny and accessible and personable and all the sort of positive things that you can get out of it. So your interpretation of the context and whether the rules should apply makes a big difference for how you assess the fact that someone was swearing or not.
Yeah, you see, I would argue that there's a definite difference in the frequency of profanity between working class and then middle class, upper middle class people, which this is something, again, that, on the face of it, people say it's a terribly offensive thing to say, how dare you make such a judgment, but the fact is, my mum, she lives slap bang in the middle of a council estate. Just the other day, 2 kids walking down the street, and honestly, Ben, they're about 5 years old, and then one of them says, "Move, Nathan, you fat cunt," and the other one replied by saying, "Shut the fuck up, you cross-eyed twat." Right, so these are 2 5-year-olds, right? And there's loads of effing and jeffing goes on around working class people, so I get that side of it. But also, due to this podcast and the history of it being based in psychology, I also work now with people in the ivory towers, so I'm around academics and the like, and they definitely do not swear to the extent that we do, and I get pulled up on it, usually politely. It's not in front of anybody. It's, can you sort of tone that down, sort of thing. I get, and I wouldn't mind, Ben. I am already toning it down, but yeah, I was wondering if there's anything sort of been objectively studied on that.
So there are lots of case studies of the sort of context in which people swear a lot. So one of the earliest one was with longshoremen in San Francisco, Oakland, in California. Yeah, and yes, as you would not be surprised to learn, longshoremen, at least this particular group of them, swear a lot. But and that led to this idea that maybe there's a sort of a class or social economic dimension to profanity, and it's certainly true that familiarity is important, and that sort of that close personal relationships tend to be differently important at different kinds of work situations. So, when you're working construction, or when you're, painting, or a longshoreman, or whatever it is, these are groups of individuals who work together a lot. They spend a lot of time together. They tend to be, at least historically, same sex. That's a context in which there's more swearing.
Yep.
Than in mixed sex or mixed gender situations. They're doing things that are hard and oftentimes dangerous, and again, those are situations where we know there's more profanity. But there have also been case studies of realtors and stockbrokers where you get the exact same effect, where when it's not the front of the house, but in the back of the house, right? When it's
Right.
the realtors talking to one another, not talking to the clients, or when it's the stockbrokers talking to one another. That, I mean, I don't know if you've seen Wolf of Wall Street,
Yes.
but I think that's a great demonstration of the kind of, and it's, it's a little bit overblown and it's very, a little bit exaggerated, I think. But yeah, but, there's lots of evidence that this happens in white collar situations just as in blue collar situations. So I think it's more a product of what is the work environment like? Is it, how much pressure is it? How much do you work together with other people that's not in an outward facing way? At least in the business world. I should also say that, because I think it's really important, that there's no evidence that use of profanity correlates with intelligence or vocabulary size or language capacity.
Yeah.
And I know that's a judgment that people oftentimes have, but
Yes.
it's actually, if anything, it's actually the opposite. If you bring people into the lab and you have them perform sort of standard language tasks, and then you also ask them to perform some profanity task, like, okay, write down all the swear words you can in a minute, or say all the swear words you can in a minute, you find that the more proficient swearers are also better at language tasks in general. And other studies find that they may also have slightly higher IQ or intellect on the Big Five personality scale. So it's not the case that just because the 5-year-olds were cursing each other out that they were demonstrating a lack of intelligence. Quite to the contrary.
Yeah, you see, again, I think that's an accusation usually that's made from a sort of position of snobbery, and I wonder whether as well it's the use of more profanity and a higher frequency of it, again, within lower class communities, is something to do with, I don't know if it's a symbolic or a linguistic representation of the environments within which they live. Almost sort of leading objectively more difficult lives leads to a higher use of profanity. And the reason I'm bringing that up is this sort of tangentially linked, I guess, is the idea of profanity as pain relief, how it can quite literally enable people to handle more pain. So I don't think you want to expand on that any.
Oh, sure. Yeah, this is work that was actually done in the UK. A researcher there by the name of Richard Stevens has done a bunch of studies trying to see what the benefits of swearing are. And one of them is this question of pain relief, because I'm sure you have the intuition, as I have, that, when you slam your finger in a door or stub your toe, or you said you've got a 10-year-old, when you step on a piece of Lego in bare feet or something like that.
Yeah.
That it feels good to swear. And so he wanted to test this. And so he brought in college students to the lab to do this task called the cold presser task, which is basically the most popular way to hurt people without damaging them, and that human subjects committees will approve. And what it is, it's really simple. You just have people stick their hand in ice water and hold it there for as long as they can. It turns out that people can do this for a couple minutes on average. But he just assigned people to either be in a swearing condition where they had to pick a swear word and just say it over and over, shit, 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 shit. Or he put them in a neutral condition where they had to say a neutral word, chair or whatever. And
just doesn't do it, does it?
It does. Well, it didn't do it. That's exactly the finding. So they were able to hold their hands in about 50% longer when they were randomly assigned to the swearing condition.
50%?
Right. Yeah. So, whatever that is, 60, 90 seconds.
Wow.
And they reported it hurt less. This was true for male participants, for female participants. The really interesting angle on the study is that he did a follow-up study where he also asked these college students how frequently they swore in their everyday lives. And this kind of gets to your point about, frequency. And what he found was that the frequent swearers, or at least the people who said that they swore frequently, gained less benefit in the pain task, right? So it's like they used up all the power of these words, right?
Yeah. Wow. As well, what's interesting about that is, so I've just recalled an incident there. I was wondering whether this is the use of profanity in a situation where someone's in pain is, it's words, it's language, it's a communication strategy. But a couple of years ago, I was out running, twisted my ankle out in the middle of a field all by myself, twisted my ankle, hit the deck, fucking effing and jeffing all over the place. There's not a soul around to hear me for miles. What do you think that says about the actual use of profanity in particular in that context?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is compatible with the story that Richard Stevens would tell, that it serves this hypoalgesic effect, that it reduces the experience of pain. And one possible explanation for why that might be is through the activation of the sort of fight or flight response. So it's known that when people are experiencing strong transient emotions, they can, especially, fear, surprise, that sort of thing, they can activate this sympathetic nervous system response. It's a fight or flight reaction that induces a bunch of physiological changes. So blood flows to your extremities so that you can fight or flee using your legs or hands. Adrenaline, that's really the critical thing, starts pumping, and that can produce this hypoalgesic effect. So that, when you punch the shark in the nose and graze your fist on its teeth, you don't feel it as badly, so you're able to punch again without recoiling in pain. And so, profanity, the production of profanity, or even hearing profanity, actually produces all of these same changes. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, sweating on the surface of the skin, and adrenaline production. And so it could be like a tool that we use to kind of hack our fight or flight system, to sort of boost it up in the same way that, athletes do. So athletes who want to get psyched up for, well, I don't know if athletes do this in the UK, but like American football players, very stereotypically will get into their huddles and, go fucking get him. Yeah, let's fucking kiss ass, It's quite possible that was my impression of American English. This is a way to psych yourself up by hooking into this system. And why you would produce it spontaneously and even without any sort of communicative purpose to anyone else is that it is this spontaneous kind of action. We now know that the brain has this separate pathway for producing profanity and for automatic speech in general that's totally different from the pathway that I'm using right now to produce this language and that you're using to understand language. We could talk a little bit about that if you like, but it's this spontaneous generation of profanity is on an emotional basis, and when experiencing pain or anger or surprise or joy or whatever, seems to be a totally unmonitored and reflexive process.
Yeah, well, when you said that, the first thing that sprang to mind was the example of Tourette's. So I believe it's sort of exaggerated as well, isn't it? Like Tourette's manifests in other ways more often than it does in this swearing and profanity. But in the cases where it does, it's interesting that this twitch that people have often tends to be the most potentially offensive thing that could be said within that particular context. And yeah, what does that condition in particular speak to?
Yeah, you're exactly right. Most people who suffer from Tourette syndrome do not have what's called coprolalia. They don't have this spontaneous production and uncontrolled production of taboo language. But some percentage do. It's hard to assess exactly what percentage because the DSM is always changing
we know that.
The classification for who has who goes under Tourette syndrome. But it's something in the range of maybe 10% to maybe even half of people with Tourette syndrome, depending on how.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, the figure I knew was about 10%. So yeah.
Tourette syndrome is complicated, and we don't fully understand how it's manifested in the brain. But we do know that one of the big differences in the brains of people with Tourette syndrome compared to with neurotypical people is in the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is this structure kind of in the you can think of it as part of the lizard brain. It's not the fancy, shiny new cerebral cortex that we have on the surface of our brain that's all evolutionarily new and does all these fancy abstract things like math and reasoning and planning and all that kind of stuff. The basal ganglia are responsible for, at least in part, for selecting and suppressing actions when you're experiencing strong emotions. And the basal ganglia of people who have Tourette syndrome are different. So what they have trouble doing is suppressing this urge to produce these strong words in reaction to some emotional trigger. Now, there are lots of other things going on with Tourette syndrome. It's comorbid with lots of other things like ADHD and obsessive compulsive disorder. And it's complicated why you would want to say those words in the first place. Oftentimes people report that the reason you obsess about not saying those words is because you know that you're not supposed to say them in this context, and you sort of get into this loop, and then you can't stop, and it becomes like a sneeze, and it just has to come out. And that's probably because of different functioning of the basal ganglia. But it turns out that the basal ganglia are super important, not just for people with Tourette syndrome, but for everyone who swears spontaneously. So when you were standing in your field, you were not using, most likely, the usual pathway to generate language. We think of the brain is lateralized for language, and it's usually in the left hemisphere, and you've got these special centers. You've got Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and these special, like, fancy things that humans have that don't seem to show up in other animals. No, that was probably a vocalization that was driven primarily by your basal ganglia.
Right,
and that you shot off, so you could have shrieked, or you could have screamed if you were a chimp, or if you were a dog, or if you were a human even. But you happen to have done some cultural learning. So when you vocalize to express strong emotions, you do it in a way that your society has said is reserved for these particular functions, for expressing these strong emotions. And so it gets filtered through this particular production pathway.
Yeah, I've just been reminded of something then as well. I don't know if I've spoken about this guy before on the podcast. I think I might have done. And this sort of ties into another little question here. So I used to run a mental health support group, and there was a guy there who had Tourette's, and his vocal tics were very sort of sexual in nature. But one of the things that he used to end up saying was if he found a girl attractive, he'd twitch and call her a sexy bitch. You fucking sexy bitch. That would come out. But as a result of that, he got success with women. They found it, honestly, they found it endearing that it was like his real, this sort of very base attraction to these women just came out, and there was nothing he could do about it. But obviously, it didn't make him like a misogynist or a pig or anything that was sort of leering at the girls and trying it on with them. Just the fact that this automatic reaction came out, the girls used to find it quite endearing, and it used to work out for him. But the reason I bring that up, as well as it being pretty cool, is sort of coming back to this context again, and this idea of maybe using a modifier, because you can call a girl a sexy bitch, and she'll take that as a compliment. But if you just call her a bitch, then that's an insult. But not sexy bitch. It's still a bitch. I've still called you a bitch. But adding that modifier to it, or qualifying it, somehow makes it okay. And I know you spoke a bit about context there before, but I'm more specifically talking about it from a linguistic standpoint, using these words like modifiers, and I don't even know if I'm using them correctly. But I was just wondering if you had anything to say about that as well. It'd be the same way as we'd use cunt as a term of endearment. Someone's a funny cunt. That's perfectly okay to say. But again, if you just call someone a cunt, even that though, I don't know. I think with context, you can call someone like, yeah, right, cunt, you, and you mean it in an affectionate way. So again, I'm just wondering if you've got anything to say about that aspect of it in particular.
Well, you're right that context is everything. I think George Carlin said it best when he said that, the words themselves are innocent. It's the way that you use them, or something like that.
Right.
Right. So in certain circumstances, using profanity is the right thing to do. So it's the way to, so if like Carlin, you're a stand-up comedian, then using that language is exactly how you create a connection with your audience, how you make them laugh, how you have them experience the emotion that you want them to. In social interaction, so like it's you and your buddies at a bar, and you're the game is over and your team lost, and you're commiserating, and you want to demonstrate your connection with them, right? You've got social work that you want to do. Yeah, we're gonna be fine, and we're all in this together. In some of those situations, swearing and even calling them by slurs and whatever can be the thing that has the social consequence that you want it to have. And if you were to say the exact same words to someone you didn't know with a different tone of voice in a different context, it could be, it could be hate speech.
Right.
So yes, it's 100% about the context. And the challenge there is, of course, when you come to moral or legal or ethical questions. When you ask, well, in that case, how do you, at what point should anyone step in and say, well, that is or that isn't an appropriate thing to say in that context? It's very hard, for example, this is happening with social media all the time. You've got these companies who are trying to make judgment calls. Was this an attack on a person when this bit of text appeared in their feed? Or was it jocular? Was it, and how could you possibly tell from the letters that appear on the screen? And I think that we're in a really challenging position if we want to try to start legislating or litigating context to try to figure out what the intent was, what was the effect, and so on.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've spoken about this. We covered hate speech in a podcast with Jeremy Waldron. He was in favour. One of the things I love about America, I'm obsessed with America, Ben. I'd love to move to America, American citizenship and all that. That's my dream. It's never going to happen, but
you want to trade?
If we can do it the same way you can swap houses in housing associations over here. If we can figure out a way, let's do it. So we've covered that. And we didn't come to any sort of agreement on it. I think for me, the First Amendment is sort of sacrosanct, and Jeremy Waldron sort of argues against the First Amendment to a certain extent, and I think that's getting into sort of dicey territory. But I'm glad you mentioned it, because something we didn't cover is this idea that's sort of linked to hate speech. And there's a quoting from your book. It says, the most potent words of all, the ones that have a direct line to the emotions, are profanity. And then if we bring in, things like racial slurs, I'm wondering with this idea of words having having a direct line to the emotions, some people say that speech can be violence. By saying certain words, that is an act of violence. Now, I think that's complete bollocks. But what's your take on that? Because there's a physiological aspect to this as well, isn't there?
Yeah. So I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm all about the measurables.
Right.
So what we can measure is physiological consequences. And it's true that profanity and slurs and so on have measurable physiological consequences on people. Elevated heart rate, adrenaline, these things that I mentioned earlier. None of those by themselves constitute harm.
Right.
I mean, you get an elevated heart rate when you text someone and are waiting to get a text back. When you see those 3 little dots or whatever, you get elevated heart rate, you get adrenaline, you get all the same things. There's nothing intrinsically negative about it. So I don't think there's a physiological case for harm. We can measure health outcomes and educational outcomes and psychological outcomes. And that, I think, is the one place where there's a hint of evidence that certain kinds of language may cause harm.
Okay.
There's basically no evidence that, just having parents who swear in the house causes any sort of long-term or short-term effects.
That's reassuring.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, here's the thing. Kids don't think you're that cool. And so when they start swearing, they're doing it because they are identifying themselves as part of an emerging group that they want to define almost exclusively by opposition to you.
Yeah.
And so the way that you speak, they want to do it differently. So if you swear, swearing's not cool. If you tell them not to swear, they will swear. If you swear this way, they'll swear this other way. So there was a really fun little experiment that the Blooms, a couple of developmental psychologists at Yale did, where they decided to try to see if they could teach their kid a new swear word. So they started replacing any word that they would ever say, any swear word, with flep. They would say flep this and flep that. And it was a disaster. The kids were totally uninterested. They swore just like their peers, and their peers, particularly peers with older siblings, would swear. And that's of course exactly as it would be. So there's no evidence that swearing around kids causes any long-term harm. There is some evidence about, and I sort of hinted at this earlier, that being called by slurs, like that's the particular thing, not being exposed to slurs, but being specifically being called by slurs. And the only evidence we have on this is about homophobic slurs, but it could be similar for racial and sex-based and other sorts of slurs, religion-based. When you track kids through middle school, you look at the 6th graders and you ask, how often are you called by slurs? And then in 7th grade and 8th grade, you just go back to those same kids and you say, hey, fill out this battery of tests, and you assess their psychological, emotional health, their connection to school, depression, anxiety, all this kind of stuff. You find that the kids who are called, fag, homo, they're called that most, are the ones that show the greatest decline over those 3 years
Right.
in these measurables. Okay, so it's correlational evidence. It is absolutely not causal. You couldn't do the randomized controlled trial where you randomly call half of the kids with slurs, right? And see if that damages them. Ethically, you could never do that. But we're starting to get some hints that maybe at least there's a correlation between being called by slurs and negative emotional and cognitive outcomes. And so that's where I would be looking to try to answer that question. Is there a possibility of harm? Not sort of a priori defining it as, well, if I'm offended, then it's harm, but rather, is there a demonstrable effect on the well-being of individuals? Starting with kids, but potentially also adults. That's how I would answer the question, I guess.
Well, no offense to Jeremy, because it was a great legal discussion, but I think you've just done a better job of putting a decent case forward in 3 minutes than he did in an hour and a half. So, it's interesting. Again, I'm not sure whether it's when you start bringing the potential legal ramifications into it and how do we legislate this stuff. I think we start getting into dicey territory. But that's interesting. Okay. So moving on to sort of finalising this, a couple more questions. One is, this is sort of linked to this FLEP. We're going to get back to FLEP in a minute. It's bygone swear words, so historical swear words. So I'm just going to go through a few here that I've found. Some of them I can't even really pronounce. So these seem to be mostly Victorian. So do a bit of a test for you here, Ben, see whether you know what some of these are. So a beard splitter.
I don't know. I don't have that one.
A beard splitter. That's a Victorian word for penis. Bed swerver, gadzooks. I'm sure I've heard people say that sort of contemporaneously.
God's hooks.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, God's hooks.
It's for the stigmata, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. An half and half is a Victorian term for a drunkard. I wonder if that's half and half. I'm wondering if that's a half pint. A half and half, as in like a pint and a half. I don't know.
Another half and another half.
Yeah, another half and another half. Yeah, a rantallion. Oh, this is good. I like this one. A rantallion. Do you know what that is, Ben?
I don't.
A weirdly specific Victorian word meaning one whose scrotum is longer than his penis.
That is weird and specific.
Yes. Okay, so let's stick with that. So let's say rantallion. Let's say if back in Victorian times that was getting thrown around left, right and centre, people calling each other rantallions, and it was offensive. And now we've never heard of it, and you hear it, and not only is it fallen out of favour, but it doesn't even meet that criterion of sounding offensive. And so I guess the question that arises out of that is, we'll get to why swear words come about in a minute. That's what we're going to end on, because we're going to try and invent a new one, and we're inevitably going to fail miserably, but we're going to have a crack. But why do these words fall out of favour?
Yeah. Well, they have a life cycle, right? So most swear words don't start their lives as swear words. I mean, some do. Sometimes a word is just invented from whole cloth and meant to be a swear word. MILF is a good example of that. Someone sat down and said, what would be a good acronym for this thing? But fuck and shit and all these are not words that started their lives as profanity. They started as something totally different.
Well, interesting. Let's just take one example. So let's take the obvious one, fuck, because what's the etymology of that then?
It's a super old Indo-European word. It's thousands of years old. There are versions in lots of other related languages. It means something like to strike or to hit.
Oh wow, okay.
Which is which is a very common pathway for words that start meaning strike or hit or something like that to gain a sex meaning. So
right, okay.
Even in contemporary American English, I don't know if you have this over there, but bang, smash, tap, these are all words that can mean have sex with.
Oh yeah, banging or smashing someone's back doors in. That's okay, one over here. Yeah.
I see. Okay, good. So,
yeah.
So, but this is super common, and it happened with fuck. It just happened with fuck.
Yeah.
a couple thousand years earlier, and
Wow.
but it doesn't really become offensive, right? It means have sex with, but it doesn't really become particularly offensive until this Victorian turn that you were sort of alluding to, where people all of a sudden start not wanting to talk about sex in public, and then not wanting to use the words for sex in public, and this one happens to sound particularly like a swear word in English, and so this is not going to be something that we say in public, and that happens in the 18th century. But before that time, it would have been used sort of more broadly. So anyway, so words gain this sort of profane status, and then all of them, without exception, eventually lose it. Now, we still have fuck. Fuck is like this amazing.
Well, that was going to
it's
say,
like
yeah.
the exception. It's like the exception that proves the rule, but it's even on its way out. So
Really?
Yeah. Well, so you couldn't see it on television.
Evidence, please.
Oh, well, okay. So I survey 100 incoming freshmen every year. Now it's an opportunity sample, so they're 18-year-old Californians mostly, and I give them a list of words and say, okay, for each word, I just do this ranking. For each word, how offensive is it from 1 to 7? And the word fuck this year, when I did it, in fall of 2019, was the 22nd most offensive word in English.
Wow. Okay.
So it's quickly falling off of the list of top most offensive words.
So what are the top 3 nowadays then? According to Californians, of course.
Yeah, I know it's a specific sample. It depends on the year, but it's usually a combination of, so nigger and cunt are usually in the very top, and then you'll get other slurs. So fag is oftentimes number 3, or faggot.
Fag. I hate that word. Yeah, I'm not a fan of those.
But there are other words that are kind of moving up that you might not expect. Retard is extremely high on the list now.
Right. Yeah.
Or retarded. Yeah, it's largely bitches up there. They're mostly slurs. There are a couple that are maybe not exactly slurs. So like cocksucker and motherfucker are usually in the top 10. But
that's genuinely fascinating that fuck is down at number 22.
Well, yeah, but it's not surprising if you think about how frequent it is. So imagine you're 10 now, and you get on the internet,
right?
Or you get on social media, or you listen to your own podcast, or you listen to, satellite radio, or whatever it is. You watch YouTube. You're going to see, 100 fucks a minute. And the consequence of that is that, just like the, Richard Stevens subjects who stop feeling much benefit from swearing when they swear a lot in their everyday lives, so you become inured to something that you're barraged with on a daily basis. And so it's sort of like, as we've seen this democratization of media and deregulation of media and reduction of censorship of media, all of a sudden kids are exposed to fuck all the time, and they don't think it's that bad. In the same way that I think in my generation we were exposed to shit very commonly, and we thought it was far less bad than our parents did. I think a really good example of that from my generation is sucks. Like, this sucks.
Right.
I don't know what it's like over there, but my parents' generation found it extremely offensive. That was very taboo in our house.
Yeah, well, I don't think sucks was sort of as ubiquitous in the UK anyway. But I don't think like my parents would consider that one offensive at all. So
interesting.
Yeah.
These generational changes happen, and so that we're experiencing a change right now where Gen Zers are not judging fuck to be anywhere near as offensive. They know that it offends some people. They know that it offends old people. So they put it on the list.
The counter example would be the N-word, though, wouldn't it? Because that is ubiquitous, and especially hip hop. In hip hop culture, it's used. I love hip hop culture. I wish they'd knock that shit on the head. I think there's a decent argument to be made for just stop saying the word, kill it off. I don't buy this reappropriation argument, but that is, it's everywhere. It's in songs all the time. Hip hop is the most, it dominates culture. It's the most popular form of music in terms of sales, but that seems to be only gathering more steam. Would you class that as a counterexample, or is it different?
It's really complicated.
Right.
I think if you ask people, the actual scholars of the word, they'll tell you usually that there are actually two words that sound very similar.
Oh, I don't buy that argument either, but okay, go on.
But in any case, whether or not that's true, the context in which it's used are very circumscribed. So you get it. You're exactly true. You get it in hip hop, and you'll see people driving down the street who normally wouldn't say the word in public, singing along to the lyrics of hip hop songs.
Yeah.
Singing the word. It is. It's a little bit different from the rest of profanity because it is a term that is used to disempower a group that is still experiencing that disempowerment, and that's very different from fuck.
Yeah, it's impersonal, isn't it? Fuck.
It's just I mean it's not being used. It's not being directed at anyone in particular.
Yeah,
right?
and it's not historically loaded either, I guess, in the same way.
So I think slurs are quite different in that way. And yeah, the question about reappropriation and so on, it's a big kettle of fish.
Yeah. Okay. So here we go. So you mentioned before, this is what we're going to try and close on here, and this is sort of manufactured to fail miserably, which is what makes it all the more interesting, I think. But that is, so what was this word? Flep. So these professors tried to invent this new swear word, and it seems to have the ingredients that we mentioned. It's a short, sharp sound. One of the things we haven't mentioned is a lot of these words seem to be 4-letter words. That's another sort of interesting phenomenon within profanity. So there's two ingredients going on there. One is it's got the 4 letters, and it's got that short, sharp, consonant-esque sound to it. Why doesn't it work? And what could they have done? What's the best way to design a new swear word and to make it catch on?
Okay, so it helps if it starts with something taboo, and I think flep doesn't start with anything taboo at all.
Right. Okay.
So if you can if there's some sort of semi-transparent way that it relates to something that's icky, then you're starting on good footing. I think you're right that the sound is important. I don't know if the fla part is actually that great. I can't think of any other English swear words that start with fla.
No, it's floppy. It's a bit it's not great, is it?
It doesn't have the right sound symbolism.
Right.
So, but it's the kind of the right length, and you've got most of the right pieces in the right places. I think something more like kunk would really get you.
Right.
But then it's got to be picked up. So it's got to be, now you're talking about dissemination in a social context, and how do you, what causes, it's kind of like memes, right? What causes this idea to spread? And, we don't have a really great record of how this happened, with fuck and shit, because, of course, we don't have written records of most of the uses of those words throughout most of history, and certainly not when they started to be used more commonly. But we do. So I mentioned MILF earlier. That's an example where we actually have a pretty good idea of exactly how that word spread.
Right.
And it was in a movie.
Yes.
In American Pie, there was a whole scene in it.
Yeah.
Where the word is defined and chanted by teenage boys, and that movie was seen by millions of people, and then it spread. But of course, that wasn't the first time the word was used. It was just the disseminating event. And so you need some sort of, in the contemporary world, you need some sort of disseminating power. If that's who knows what that is? If it's through media, like through traditional media like movies and music, or whether it's social media. If there's an influencer that starts using it, you need someone to make it be cool. Because the people who are going to pick it up are people who want to identify with the sort of cultural movement that it is associated with. So whether if you want to hit high school kids, then it needs to be someone that high school kids think is cool, or some music or television or video product that they want to identify with, that they want to show other people in their social group that they are familiar with, that they're part of. And the same would be true if you wanted to hit 40-year-olds. You would find whatever 40-year-olds are interested in, and insert it into that context. and then you cross your fingers and hope that it works, because of course, like any sort of marketing, advertising, memification idea, it's subject to, I mean, it's a stochastic process. You can't predict what's going to happen. You can just create the circumstances that make it most likely for it to happen.
Yeah, I guess like with the example you threw out, then cump. So obviously similar to another existing word, but as well, it's with MILF, it's already anchored to something, isn't it? So cump, it doesn't conjure up any sort of image that's either sexualized or activates the disgust mechanism or anything like that. There's nothing to anchor it to in that sense.
Yeah, you need something that can be a backstory. So I think the example that I give in one of the chapters is the example of taint. So there's this
That's a fucking terrible word.
I mean, it's perfect. Like the sound of it is perfect for a swear word, right? It's got the t at the beginning, the nt at the end. It's one syllable.
Yeah,
right? And it catches on because there's this backstory that people who, well, okay, because it refers to something that activates a disgust reaction, but also it's got this sort of hidden in plain sight feature to it, that it's kind of a code. It's a shibboleth, right? It's
great word.
If you know the secret behind it, then you know why it means what it means. And that creates this sort of sense of it's an in-group word. Yeah, so if there's something like that would help.
Yeah, you've just reminded me. Well, this is what we'll finish on, Ben. I'd be interested to know what your worst word is. A word that it doesn't necessarily have to be one that's necessarily profanity. Mine is, I hate this word.
Moist.
Oh, it's almost there. Smegma. To me, that's the worst word in the English language, and I don't even know if that necessarily counts as profanity in any sense. What's number one for you?
I don't have word aversions. So what you're describing is this phenomenon that some people experience. I think it's 5 to 10% of people, where it's just there are certain words, not necessarily because of what they mean, but just the sound of, just like the word itself is just, they can't.
Yeah, it's disgusting.
It's not offensive to them because it's profanity. Yeah, it's just a disgusting sounding word. Moist is the most common one.
Smegma is moist, so it's got both going on.
This is above my pay grade, but I don't really have word aversions like that. I can tell you that, having studied language for however many decades, I feel like I'm sort of I find some language very interesting. I find it fascinating that people could invent a word like this.
Do you find any words beautiful?
You mean in the sort of like, French, papillon. Oh, it's such a beautiful...
Yeah, and like in a poetic sense, yeah.
I guess I'm. It's one of these things. You study it enough, and it starts to lose any.
Right, that's a shame. Mm-hmm. Do you read novels? Do you read novels at all?
Well, before I had kids.
Oh, right, okay. But you see, that'd be the thing for me. I totally get that. That the more you become immersed in something, it loses its inherent beauty, or the beauty of it that's inherent to the extent that you're ignorant of the inner workings of it. So I'm just wondered if whether...
Yeah, I guess what I find beautiful is what surprises me. If you apply your analytical mind to something enough, you believe that you have some mastery over it and you can predict what's going to happen next. And then you come across something very surprising, like you hear Australian people saying "Cuntwaffle," and you think it's beautiful in its difference. It's beautiful I would never have predicted that "Cuntwaffle" would be a thing that anyone would say, but but because of the juxtaposition of one of the strongest words of the language and a crispy, delicious breakfast, it seems like something that a creative mind can produce, and I guess I find the potential for creativity in human language use to be beautiful.
Well, I tell you what, Ben, I was trying to end with a sort of palate cleanser, because we've done fucking bollocks and taints and smegma, and we should have ended on shibboleth, because that's a great word, but we're ending on cuntwaffle. So, Professor Ben Bergen, thank you very much for joining me. Is there any Any links you'd like to direct the listeners towards, websites, books coming up, anything like that, feel free to plug away for a moment.
Oh no, I'm not in plugging mode. You can.
I'll do it for
I'm
you.
not
then.
on any of the social media or anything like that. You can. There are a couple other Ben Bergens, but if you Google me, you'll find my webpage, and you'll find my books and some papers and some things that I've written. And I'm around.
Okay, well, no need to go to Google because I will include all those links in the description of the podcast. So in the meantime, Ben, thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks, Danny.